During the 6th century, both the Avars and the Slavs were wreaking havoc throughout the Byzantine Balkans, with both parties constantly harassing the countryside from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. Formerly, during the early part of Emperor Justinian's reign, the system of forts, or limes, along the Danube protected the empire from barbarian incursions. As Justinian's ambition led him to set his sights on further and further targets, the Danube limes began to suffer. After years of neglect, the Avars and the Slavs, as discussed in the prologue, crossed the great river. Because of their similarities, the Avars and the Slavs were often named interchangeably by Byzantine sources. But there was one significant difference between the two peoples. While the Avars would raid Byzantine lands and then return to their homeland north of the Danube in the province of Pannonia, the Slavs settled many of the lands they raided, possibly fearing the Avar rule in the north. For the next 50 years, the Slavs continued to push farther and farther into Byzantine land, until by 578 AD, they were raiding and settling as far south as the Peloponnese. These migrations were not an isolated event, as the Slavic colonies in Greece would be further reinforced by immigrating Slavic tribes like the Melinges and the Ezerites. Some sources put the number of immigrating Slavs in the realm of 100,000. Though this may be, as most things in history are, an exaggeration, the amount of immigrating Slavs must nevertheless have been immense. In addition to near constant warfare, the Byzantines also engaged in complex diplomacy. In fact, pitting barbarian groups against each other by offering protection and tribute to one of the sides was one of the few ways that the Eastern Roman Empire could keep control over the Balkans while their troops were engaged elsewhere. Inter-tribe diplomacy was also commonplace, but usually unsuccessful. For example, the Slavs, after their incursion into the Byzantine Empire, had received an offer of protection from the Avars. The chieftain of the Avars, Kagan Bayan I, sent an envoy offering suzerainty to the Slavic chieftain Dauratas, an envoy who was promptly executed by the men of Dauratas. The Slavic chieftain who declared, "Others do not conquer our land, we conquer theirs. This is how it shall always be." Ironic, seeing as the Serbs and Croats would spend much of the next 1500 years under the thumb of either the Ottomans or the Austrians. The Byzantine Emperor Tiberius II, perhaps seeing the newly made rift between the two tribes, paid the Avar cognate 80,000 gold to defend the Danube frontier from barbarian invaders. This job included chasing away the Slavs. Emperor Tiberius requested 60,000 Avar horsemen to destroy Slavic settlements. Unfortunately for the emperor, the Slavs, having heard of the impending attack, fled into the woods, creating one of the first, but certainly not the last, unsuccessful attempt to deal with the Slavic settlers. Emperor Tiberius' next defeat would come in the city of Sirmium. Sirmium, a city on the northern border of the Sava, only a few kilometers west of Belgrade, had quickly become vital to Roman operations in the Balkans. It was named one of the 4 capitals of the empire. At its peak, the city had an estimated 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities of antiquity. In the 4th century, as the Roman Empire began to decline, the Goths took the city, becoming the first of many barbarian nations to hold the city until the Eastern Roman Empire reconquered it in 567 AD. Despite the tribute the Byzantines were paying the Avars for peace, in 580 AD, Kagan Bayan I proceeded to besiege the city. The largely unfortified walls had a minuscule garrison due to Byzantine preoccupation in the Middle East in the Sassanid War. Despite chieftain Dauratas' refusal of the Kagan's offer of suzerainty, the Slavs were still under some influence of the Avars, because while Kagan Bayan laid siege to Sirmium, the Slavs continued to raid the provinces of Thrace and Macedonia to prevent Byzantine reinforcements to arrive from Constantinople or further east. While he was not able to send more forces, Emperor Tiberius was able to send an envoy, Theognis, to negotiate with the Kagan. Theognis soon got to work, proposing new tributes and concessions, but despite even offering one of the emperor's daughters, Theognis and the Kagan were unable to come to an agreement. The small garrison was able to hold out for 3 years, but soon enough Theognis was forced to surrender the city and continue the payment of the Byzantine tribute. In exchange, Tiberius would be allowed to evacuate the population of the surrendered city.
Just to clear up a little bit the relationship between the Slavs and Avars, there is evidence that some Slavic tribes were subjugated by the Avars and formed part of their army, often fighting far away from their own homeland. For example, in 603, Bion II sent Sclavian warriors to help the Lombards retake Cremona. These subjugated Slavs were most likely the ones that were settled in Roman territory, and the same Slavs that assisted the Avars in their siege of Sirmium. Roman efforts to drive out these settled Slavs were rare, if not non-existent. But another group of Slavs existed, likely those led by Daratas, most likely north of the Danube, beyond the Roman frontier. These would be the Slavs that the Avars were paid to destroy, and the target of most of Roman Slavic conflicts. Unfortunately, the primary sources do not distinguish between these two groups, therefore doing so within this narrative is incredibly cumbersome. After the success at Sirmium, the Avars and Slavs continued to raid and pillage down and across the Balkans after the new Byzantine Emperor Maurice refused to increase their tribute to 100,000 solidi a year. By 583, they took the cities of Sinegundinum and Vimisatium, and 8 more cities by 586. In 591, some troubling news came to the Balkans. The Byzantines had made peace with the Persians, meaning that they could turn their full attention to restoring control of the West. An army of veteran soldiers under the general Priscus moved into Thrace. The Slavs under Daratas, who at the time were preparing for a raid across the Danube, were taken by surprise and defeated in the night by Priscus's men. The Slavs would meet the Byzantines again next year. This time, they faced the general Peter, Emperor Maurice's brother. The 600 Slavs returning from a raid were carrying their booty in wagons. To protect themselves from the Romans, the Slavs set up the wagons as barricades, foreshadowing the Bohemian war wagons of the late Middle Ages. The wagons held for some time, but they and the Slavs were eventually cut down by the Byzantine soldiers. However, Peter's attempts to cross the Danube River were largely unsuccessful. This did not deter Priscus, who continued to fight the Slavs on the northern bank through the conclusion of the Avar-Byzantine Wars, which changed the status of the Danube from a border to an intermedium. As an intermedium, Byzantine armies were allowed to cross the river to fight Slavic armies without breaking the peace with the Avars. However, as the years went by and internal conflicts rocked the empire, the Byzantine presence in the Balkans once again began to dwindle. Only a decade after the turn of the century, most Balkan cities were powerless to deal with the barbarian presence just outside their walls. But perhaps no other city was as strong a symbol of the Slavic threat as the great city of Thessaloniki, which by 617 was under siege. Join us next time as we look at not the first and not the last Slavic siege of Thessaloniki.